The soft hum of the airport terminal faded into the background as the Jacobs family made their way towards the first-class check-in counter. Darryl Jacobs, a distinguished lawyer known for his sharp mind and unwavering integrity, walked with confidence, his carry-on bag slung over his shoulder. Beside him, his wife Vanessa, a brilliant professor whose research had garnered international acclaim, held their son Marcus's hand. The teenager's eyes darted excitedly from one corner of the bustling airport to another, taking in the sights and sounds of their impending adventure. This trip was more than just a vacation. It was a celebration of years of hard work, sleepless nights, and relentless pursuit of excellence. The Jacobs family had climbed the ladder of success rung by rung, overcoming obstacles that many in their position might have found insurmountable. Now, dressed in comfortable yet stylish travel attire, they exuded an air of quiet confidence that came from knowing they had earned every moment of this luxury. As they approached the counter, the attendant greeted them with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Jacobs. We've been expecting you," she said, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she processed their check-in. Marcus leaned against the counter, his eyes wide with wonder at the exclusive treatment they were receiving. "First time flying first class, young man?" the attendant asked, noticing Marcus's excitement. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, a grin spreading across his face. "I can't wait to see what it's like." Darryl chuckled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's a treat, son. A well-deserved one for all of us." With their boarding passes in hand, the family made their way through security and towards the first-class lounge. The plush carpets and muted lighting of the lounge created an atmosphere of tranquility, a stark contrast to the bustling main terminal they had just left behind. As they settled into the comfortable leather chairs, Vanessa couldn't help but reflect on their journey. "Can you believe it, Darryl?" she mused, her voice low and filled with emotion. 10 years ago, we were scraping by, barely able to afford a bus ticket, and now look at us." Darryl reached over and squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with pride and love. "We've come a long way, honey, and we've done it together." As they sipped on complimentary champagne and sparkling apple juice for Marcus, the family chatted excitedly about their upcoming vacation. They had plans to visit historical sites, indulge in local cuisines, and simply enjoy each other's company away from the demands of their busy lives. When the time came to board, they made their way to the gate, joining the small queue of first-class passengers. As they stepped onto the plane, the difference was immediately apparent. The first-class cabin was spacious, with wide, plush seats that promised comfort for the long flight ahead. Marcus practically bounced into his window seat, pressing his face against the glass to watch the ground crew at work. Darryl and Vanessa settled in beside him, smiling at their son's enthusiasm. "This is amazing!" Marcus exclaimed, his voice filled with awe as he explored the features of his seat. "Look at all these buttons," Vanessa laughed, her heart full of joy at her son's excitement. "Just don't eject yourself into space, okay?" As other passengers filed in, the Jacobs family couldn't help but notice the curious glances thrown their way. While some were friendly, others seemed tinged with something less pleasant, surprise, perhaps, or even disapproval. But the family paid it no mind, too caught up in their own happiness to let others' opinions dampen their spirits. It was then that Patricia Moore entered the cabin. Her designer outfit and meticulously styled hair marked her as someone accustomed to luxury. She moved with an air of entitlement, her eyes scanning the cabin as if taking inventory. When her gaze fell upon the Jacobs family, something in her expression changed. At first, it was subtle, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening of the lips. But as she watched them laugh and chat, their joy evident for all to see, Patricia's face hardened into a mask of barely concealed hostility. For a moment, she stood there, her Louis Vuitton bag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. Then, with a theatrical sigh that drew the attention of nearby passengers, she approached the flight attendant. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "I think there's been a mistake." The flight attendant, a young woman with a professional smile, turned to Patricia with a questioning look. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Patricia leaned in, her voice lowered to a stage whisper. "And that family," she said, nodding towards the Jacobs. "They don't belong here. Can you check their tickets?" The flight attendant's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes darting between Patricia and the Jacobs family. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all passengers have been correctly seated. Is there a problem with your seat?" Patricia's nostrils flared, her frustration growing. "No, you don't understand. People like them, they don't fly first class. There must be some mistake." The young attendant's professional demeanor cracked slightly, a look of discomfort crossing her face. But before she could respond, Patricia continued, her voice rising. "I paid good money for my seat, and I expect a certain ambiance. You understand, don't you?" As Patricia's words hung in the air, a hush fell over the first-class cabin. The Jacobs family, now aware of the commotion, exchanged glances. Daryl's jaw tightened, while Vanessa placed a protective hand on Marcus's arm. The boy looked up at his parents, confusion and hurt clouding his young face. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of their journey and spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the confines of this first-class cabin. The tension in the air was palpable as the flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, approached the Jacobs family. Her steps were hesitant, her professional smile strained as she neared their seats. Daryl, ever observant, had already noticed the exchange between the attendant and Patricia. He straightened in his seat, his lawyer's instincts kicking in as he prepared for what was to come. "Excuse me, sir," the attendant began, her voice low and apologetic. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but would you mind if I took a look at your boarding passes?" Vanessa's grip on Marcus's arm tightened imperceptibly. She exchanged a look with Daryl, years of shared experiences and unspoken understanding passing between them in that brief moment. Daryl nodded almost imperceptibly, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with a quiet intensity. Without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced their boarding passes. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he were in a courtroom presenting evidence. He handed the passes to the attendant, maintaining eye contact the entire time. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice level but with an undercurrent of steel that made it clear he knew exactly what was happening. The attendant quickly scanned the passes, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "No, sir. Everything is in order. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." As she stepped back, Patricia's voice cut through the awkward silence. "Well, are they in the right seats or not?" The attendant turned to Patricia, her professional demeanor straining under the weight of the situation. "Ma'am, their tickets are valid for first class. There's no mistake." Patricia's face contorted with disbelief and anger. She stepped forward, her designer heels clicking on the cabin floor. "There must be a mistake," she insisted, her voice rising. "They don't belong here. I paid for my seat, and I expect to be surrounded by people who deserve to be here." Her words hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to be engrossed in their phones or magazines, while others watched the unfolding drama with undisguised interest. Marcus, young but not naive, felt the weight of Patricia's words. He looked up at his mother, his eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "Mom," he whispered, "why is that lady so angry? Did we do something wrong?" Vanessa's heart broke at the innocence in her son's question. She squeezed his hand reassuringly, her voice low and steady as she replied, "No, baby, we didn't do anything wrong. Some people just have a hard time seeing past their own prejudices." Daryl, who had remained seated throughout the exchange, slowly rose to his full height. He cut an impressive figure, his tailored casual wear doing nothing to diminish the aura of authority he carried. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but charged with a quiet power that commanded attention. "Ma'am," he addressed Patricia directly, "we paid for our seats, just like you. I don't believe our presence is causing you any inconvenience, so perhaps it's best if you return to your own seat." Patricia, however, was not to be deterred. Her face flushed with a combination of anger and embarrassment, but her voice dripped with disdain as she responded, "Oh, I see. You think money just buys you class, don't you? Well, I've been flying first class for years, and I know when someone doesn't belong. People like you are just here to show off. A collective intake of breath could be heard throughout the cabin. Patricia's words had crossed a line, making explicit what had only been implied before. Daryl's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Vanessa beat him to it. Rising from her seat, Vanessa's voice was sharp and controlled, like a blade honed to perfection. People like us, she repeated, her words cutting through the tension. Do you mean a successful lawyer, a tenured professor, and their son? Or is it just that we're black? Patricia froze, caught off guard by Vanessa's bluntness. For a moment, she faltered, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The cabin fell into a stunned silence, the raw truth of Vanessa's words laying bare the ugly reality of the situation. But Patricia's pride wouldn't let her back down. She rallied, her voice shrill as she responded. I didn't mean that. I just think that first class should be for people who fit in. By now, the confrontation had drawn the attention of everyone in the first-class cabin. The flight attendant hovered nearby, looking increasingly distressed and unsure how to defuse the situation. Other passengers watched with a mix of discomfort and fascination, the kind of morbid interest that comes from witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Daryl, still standing, leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his voice edged with steel. If you're implying we don't fit in because of our skin color, you're sorely mistaken. You don't know who we are or what we've accomplished. And frankly, we don't need to justify ourselves to you. As he spoke, a young woman a few rows back pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction. You're really going to keep going with this, she called out to Patricia, her voice breaking through the tension. You're digging yourself into a hole. Patricia's face, already flushed, turned an even deeper shade of red. She glared at the young woman with the phone, then back at Daryl, who met her gaze unflinchingly. The standoff continued for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Finally, Vanessa spoke again, her voice cool and collected. If you're so concerned about class, she said, perhaps you should start by learning some yourself. A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Patricia, realizing she was quickly losing whatever ground she thought she had, turned on her heel and stomped back to her seat. But even as she retreated, she couldn't resist muttering under her breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. As Patricia settled into her seat, pointedly avoiding eye contact with anyone, the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged. The Jacobs family, having stood their ground with dignity, began to relax back into their seats. Marcus, who had watched the entire exchange with wide eyes, looked at his parents with a mixture of confusion and admiration. Are you okay, sweetie? Vanessa asked, running a hand through her son's hair. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm okay. But why did she say those things? We didn't do anything to her. Daryl sighed, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes, son, people judge others based on how they look, not who they are. It's not right, but it happens. What's important is how we respond to it. As the family settled back in, trying to reclaim the excitement they had felt earlier, they were unaware that this confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was about to take a turn that none of them could have anticipated. The first-class cabin buzzed with hushed conversations in the wake of the confrontation. Passengers stole furtive glances at both the Jacobs family and Patricia, the air thick with unresolved tension. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, their practiced smiles strained as they tried to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy. Daryl Jacobs sat with his arm protectively around Marcus, while Vanessa leaned in close, speaking softly to their son. They were determined to salvage their family vacation, to not let this incident overshadow the joy and relaxation they had been looking forward to for months. Remember, Marcus, Vanessa said, her voice gentle but firm, your worth isn't determined by what others think of you. It's about who you are and what you do. Marcus nodded, his young face serious as he absorbed his mother's words. I know, Mom. I just don't understand why she was so mean. Daryl squeezed his son's shoulder. Son, there are people in this world who fear what they don't understand. Sometimes that fear turns into anger, but that's their problem, not ours. As the family continued their quiet conversation, Patricia sat rigidly in her seat, her face a mask of indignation. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a message. A nearby passenger, curious about the commotion, leaned over slightly, catching a glimpse of Patricia's screen. The message she was composing was addressed to the airline's customer service, filled with complaints about disruptive passengers and demands for compensation. The passenger, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier. Don't you think you're taking this a bit too far?" Patricia's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. "I don't recall asking for your opinion," she hissed. "This is between me and the airline." The man held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time to let it go. They have as much right to be here as any of us." His words, though meant to calm the situation, had the opposite effect. Patricia's voice rose, drawing attention once again. "Let it go. Why should I? I paid good money for a first-class experience, and that includes being surrounded by first-class people." Her outburst echoed through the cabin, causing several passengers to turn in their seats. The Jacobs family, who had been trying to move past the incident, found themselves once again at the center of unwanted attention. Daryl, his patience wearing thin, stood up slowly. His imposing figure commanded attention, and a hush fell over the cabin as he spoke. "Ma'am, I've tried to be polite, but you're making it very difficult. Your discomfort with our presence says more about you than it does about us. I suggest you take a moment to reflect on why you feel so threatened by a family enjoying their vacation." His words, measured and calm, seemed to hang in the air. Several passengers nodded in agreement, murmurs of support rippling through the cabin. Patricia, however, was too far gone in her indignation to back down. She stood as well, her face contorted with anger. "Threatened? By you? Don't flatter yourself. I'm simply trying to maintain the standards that first-class travel should uphold." The young woman who had been recording earlier spoke up again, her phone still pointed at the unfolding scene. "The only person lowering the standards here is you," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your behavior is what's truly classless." Patricia whirled to face the young woman, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "How dare you? You have no right to record me without my permission." "Actually," the young woman replied calmly, "this is a public space, and I have every right to document what's happening. People need to see this, how racism and prejudice can rear their ugly heads even in places like this." The cabin erupted into a chorus of voices, some defending the Jacobs family, others trying to calm the situation, and a few, though notably fewer, muttering in support of Patricia. The flight attendants, looking increasingly distressed, conferred quickly before one of them hurried towards the cockpit. Amidst the chaos, Marcus tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," he said, his voice barely audible above the commotion, "I don't feel good about this. Maybe we should just move." Daryl knelt down to his son's eye level, his voice gentle but firm. "No, Marcus, we're not going to move. We have every right to be here, and sometimes you have to stand your ground against injustice. Remember what we've taught you about dignity and self-respect." Marcus nodded slowly, his young face a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. Vanessa placed a comforting hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes meeting Daryl's over their child's head. In that silent exchange, they reaffirmed their unity and determination to turn this ugly incident into a teachable moment for their son. As the argument continued to escalate, with Patricia growing increasingly shrill and other passengers becoming more vocal in their disapproval of her behavior, a new voice cut through the din. "Excuse me?" came a calm, authoritative voice. "But are you Daryl Jacobs, the attorney who won that landmark case against the state last year?" The question hung in the air, momentarily silencing the heated argument. All eyes turned to the source of the voice, an older gentleman in a crisp suit, his silver hair and dignified bearing marking him as someone of importance. Daryl, slightly taken aback by the unexpected question, nodded. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice measured and calm despite the tension still palpable in the air. The older man's face broke into a warm smile. "I thought I recognized you. I read about your work extensively. That was an incredible victory. Changed a lot of lives, didn't it?" As Daryl thanked him quietly, not wanting to add fuel to the already volatile situation, the man continued. "And you must be Vanessa Jacobs, right? The professor who's been featured in those academic journals on racial equality. My daughter's a huge fan of your work. She's doing her PhD thesis on some of your theories." Vanessa, surprised but pleased, nodded in acknowledgement. "That's very kind of you to say. Please give your daughter my best wishes for her studies." The revelation seemed to ripple through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been watching the confrontation with a mixture of discomfort and fascination now looked at the Jacobs family with newfound respect and admiration. Patricia, still standing in the aisle, seemed to deflate as the implications of what she was hearing sank in. Her face, previously flushed with anger, now paled visibly. She had just publicly insulted and attempted to humiliate a family of considerable accomplishment and influence, far more than she could have imagined. The young woman with the phone, sensing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, couldn't resist driving the point home. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now quiet cabin. "We have here a renowned civil rights attorney, a respected professor of racial equality, and their son? And you thought they didn't belong in first class?" Patricia opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She glanced around the cabin, seeing the looks of disapproval and disgust directed her way. Slowly, she sank back into her seat, the fight seeming to drain out of her. The older gentleman who had recognized the Jacobs family turned to address the cabin at large. "I think we've all witnessed something important here today," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "It's a stark reminder that prejudice and discrimination can lurk anywhere, even in places we consider elite or exclusive." He then turned back to the Jacobs family, his expression apologetic. "I'm deeply sorry you had to experience this. Your presence here is not just warranted, it's an honor for the rest of us to travel alongside you." Daryl, ever the diplomat, nodded graciously. "Thank you, sir. We appreciate your kind words. Our hope is that incidents like this can lead to greater understanding and change." Vanessa, her arm still protectively around Marcus, added, "If this experience helps even one person reconsider their prejudices, then some good will have come from it." As the tension in the cabin began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of shared embarrassment and reflection, the flight attendants began to move through the aisles again. They offered apologies to the Jacobs family, along with complimentary drinks and assurances that the airline would be addressing the incident. Marcus, who had been quiet throughout much of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of confusion and pride. "Everyone's treating us differently now that they know who you are. But we were the same people before, right?" Vanessa hugged her son close. "That's absolutely right, sweetheart, and that's an important lesson to remember. A person's worth isn't determined by their accomplishments or recognition, but by their character and how they treat others." Daryl nodded in agreement. "Your mom's right, son." The plane began its taxi down the runway, but for many of the passengers, this flight had already been a journey, one that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about society and themselves. And for the Jacobs family, while the incident had been painful, it had also reaffirmed their commitment to their work and to each other. As the plane lifted off, carrying them towards their long-awaited vacation, Daryl, Vanessa, and Marcus knew that they had not just stood their ground, they had paved the way for important conversations and, hopefully, meaningful change. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into an uneasy calm. The Jacobs family, having weathered the storm with grace and dignity, found themselves the center of a different kind of attention. Passengers who had remained silent during the confrontation now approached them, offering words of support and admiration. A middle-aged woman leaned across the aisle, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier. Your family's composure in the face of such blatant prejudice was inspiring." Daryl nodded, accepting her words with a gentle smile. "Thank you," he replied. "It's not always easy to speak up in the moment. What matters is that we all reflect on these experiences and strive to do better." Meanwhile, Marcus sat quietly, his young mind processing the events of the past hour. He watched as his parents graciously accepted the apologies and praise of their fellow passengers, noting how they maintained their dignity throughout. It was a lesson in grace under pressure that would stay with him for years to come. Vanessa, ever the educator, saw an opportunity in this moment. She turned to her son, her voice low but filled with purpose. "Marcus, what do you think about all of this?" The boy was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I think it's sad that Lady judged us without knowing us, but I'm proud of how you and Dad handled it. You didn't get angry or mean, even when she was." Vanessa smiled, running a hand through her son's hair. "That's right, sweetheart. It's important to stand up for yourself, but it's equally important to do so with dignity and respect. We can't control how others act, but we can control how we respond." As the flight progressed, the young woman who had recorded the incident approached the family. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her tone apologetic yet determined. "But I've already posted the video online. It's going viral." She held out her phone, showing them the rapidly increasing view count and the flood of supportive comments. "People need to see this kind of thing, how it happens in plain sight, even in spaces like this." Daryl and Vanessa exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Daryl spoke. "We appreciate your intention to bring awareness to this issue. However, we hope this doesn't lead to any personal attacks. Our goal is to educate and promote understanding, not to punish or shame." The young woman nodded earnestly. "Of course, I understand. I've been careful not to identify anyone specifically. It's about the issue, not the individuals." As news of the video spread, the incident began to take on a life of its own. Passengers on the plane found themselves part of a larger conversation about race, privilege, and the subtle and not-so-subtle ways discrimination manifests in daily life. A businessman, a few rows ahead, turned in his seat, addressing the cabin at large. "You know, I've always considered myself pretty open-minded," he began, his voice thoughtful. "But watching what happened here today, it's made me realize I might have some blind spots I need to address." His words seemed to open a floodgate of reflection among the passengers. Soon, the first-class cabin was filled with quiet conversations about personal experiences with prejudice, unconscious biases, and the responsibility of bystanders to speak up against injustice. For Patricia, the flight had become an exercise in humiliation and self-reflection. She sat rigid in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, the gravity of her actions weighing heavily upon her. The whispers and glances thrown her way were a constant reminder of her very public display of prejudice. As the flight attendants began preparing for the meal service, one of them approached Patricia with a discreet but firm demeanor. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "the captain has asked me to inform you that upon landing, you'll be met by airline representatives to discuss today's incident." Patricia nodded mutely, the full consequences of her actions beginning to dawn on her. She glanced towards the Jacobs family, a mix of emotions playing across her face: shame, regret, and a dawning realization of her own prejudices. Meanwhile, Vanessa had taken out her laptop, inspired by the day's events. "I think," she said to Daryl, "there's an important paper to be written about this experience, about how spaces of privilege can become battlegrounds for racial equality." Daryl squeezed her hand supportively. "And perhaps," he added, "there's a legal angle to explore as well, about the responsibilities of companies to ensure equal treatment of all their customers." As they brainstormed ideas, bouncing thoughts off each other with the ease of longtime partners, Marcus watched his parents with admiration. He saw not just his mom and dad, but two professionals passionate about using their skills and experiences to make a difference in the world. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of conversations, reflections, and moments of connection between passengers who, just hours ago, had been strangers. The Jacobs family found themselves at the center of it all, not as victims of discrimination, but as catalysts for change and understanding. As the plane began its descent, there was a palpable sense that everyone on board had been part of something significant. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice had transformed into a powerful lesson in resilience, dignity, and the ongoing work of building a more equitable society. For Daryl, Vanessa, and Marcus, the vacation ahead now held a deeper meaning. They had been reminded of the importance of their work, the strength they possessed as a family, and the impact that standing up for one's rights with grace and dignity could have. As the wheels touched down on the runway, it was clear that the journey that had begun in that first-class cabin was far from over. In fact, for many, it was just beginning. As the plane taxied to the gate, the passengers in the first-class cabin began gathering their belongings, the usual rush to disembark tempered by the weight of the day's events. Patricia Moore, her face a mask of discomfort and regret, was among the first to stand, clearly eager to escape the scrutiny of her fellow travelers. However, as she reached for her designer carry-on in the overhead compartment, a voice from the plane's speaker system caught everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated for a moment. We'll begin disembarking shortly, but we have a special announcement for our first-class passengers." Patricia froze, her hand still on her bag, a look of dread crossing her face. She glanced around nervously, noting the mixed expressions of curiosity and knowing looks from the other passengers. The Jacobs family, still seated, exchanged glances but remained calm and composed. A smartly dressed woman in an airline uniform entered the first-class cabin, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and professional. "I'm Sarah Thompson, the airline's chief customer officer. I want to personally address the incident that occurred during this flight." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the cabin before settling on the Jacobs family. "To the Jacobs family, on behalf of our airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the treatment you experienced today. Your dignity and grace in the face of such behavior is commendable, and we want you to know that we do not tolerate discrimination of any kind on our flights." Daryl nodded in acknowledgement, his arm protectively around Marcus. Vanessa, ever the diplomat, spoke up. "We appreciate your addressing this, Ms. Thompson. We hope this incident can lead to positive changes in how airlines handle such situations." Sarah nodded earnestly. "Absolutely, Professor Jacobs. In fact, we'd like to invite you and Mr. Jacobs to consult with our diversity and inclusion team to help us improve our policies and training." As murmurs of approval rippled through the cabin, Sarah's attention turned to Patricia, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Ms. Moore," she said, her tone noticeably cooler, "we'll need you to remain on board for a discussion about today's events. There will be consequences for your actions, including being banned from our airline for the foreseeable future." Patricia's face paled, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. But I have a connecting flight," she stammered, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "We're aware," Sarah replied firmly. "Alternative arrangements will be discussed in our meeting." As the other passengers began to disembark, many stopped to offer words of support to the Jacobs family. The young woman who had recorded the incident lingered, showing them her phone. "The videos exploded online," she said. "You've become overnight symbols in the fight against casual racism." Daryl and Vanessa exchanged a look, both recognizing the power and responsibility that came with such unexpected publicity. Marcus, observing it all, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "are we famous now?" Vanessa chuckled softly, ruffling her son's hair. "Not famous, sweetheart, but sometimes standing up for what's right can have a bigger impact than we expect." As they finally rose to leave, Patricia sat alone in her seat, the weight of her actions visible in her slumped shoulders. As Daryl passed her row, he paused for a moment. Patricia looked up, expecting anger or gloating, but was met with a gaze of composed dignity. "I hope," Daryl said quietly, "that today has been as educational for you as it has been challenging for us." With that, he moved on, leaving Patricia to contemplate the full impact of her prejudice. Stepping off the plane, the Jacobs family was greeted by a flurry of activity. News of the incident had spread rapidly, and local media were already gathered, hoping for a statement. Airport security escorted them to a private lounge, shielding them from the immediate frenzy. Inside the lounge, Daryl turned to his family. "Well," he said with a wry smile, "this wasn't quite the start to our vacation we had planned." Vanessa nodded, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "No, it wasn't," she agreed. "But maybe it's an opportunity to make a real difference." Marcus, who had been quietly absorbing everything, spoke up. "Dad, Mom, are we still going on vacation?" Daryl knelt down to his son's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, we are, son. We're not going to let what happened change our plans, but we might need to do a few important things first. Is that okay with you?" Marcus nodded solemnly. "Yeah, it's okay. I think what happened on the plane was important." Vanessa smiled proudly at her son's maturity. "It was, sweetheart, and how we respond to it is just as important." As the family discussed their next steps, Sarah Thompson re-entered the lounge. "Mr. and Mrs. Jacobs," she began, "I hate to intrude, but there are some reporters outside asking for a statement. You're under no obligation, of course, but if you're willing, it could be a powerful moment." Daryl and Vanessa exchanged a look, years of silent communication allowing them to reach a decision in seconds. "We'll do it," Daryl said. "But we'd like to keep it brief and focused on moving forward, not dwelling on the negative." Sarah nodded appreciatively. "Of course, we'll have someone escort you and make sure things don't get out of hand." As the Jacobs family prepared to face the media, Patricia Moore was escorted off the plane, her face hidden behind large sunglasses. She clutched her phone, scrolling frantically through social media, watching as her name and face became synonymous with the kind of casual racism often confronted in public spaces. The airport's press room was abuzz with activity as journalists and cameras jostled for position. When the Jacobs family entered, a hush fell over the crowd. Daryl, Vanessa, and Marcus stood together, a united front in the face of unexpected publicity. Daryl stepped up to the microphone, his lawyer's training evident in his composed demeanor. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and clear. "What happened on our flight today is unfortunately not uncommon. Many face discrimination daily, often in less public ways. Our family was simply trying to enjoy a vacation, just like anyone else." Vanessa stepped forward, her academic's precision complementing Daryl's legal eloquence. "We hope this incident serves not as a source of division, but as a catalyst for important conversations about race, privilege, and the work we still need to do as a society." A reporter called out, "Do you plan to take legal action against the airline or the woman involved?" Daryl shook his head. "No, we don't. The airline has responded appropriately, and we believe education is more powerful than punishment. We hope this experience leads to positive changes in policy and heightened awareness." Another journalist asked, "Oh, what message do you have for others who might face similar situations?" Vanessa answered this one, her voice firm but compassionate. "Stand your ground with dignity. Know your worth is not determined by others' prejudices. And to bystanders, speak up. Silence in the face of discrimination only perpetuates it." As the press conference continued, Patricia Moore sat in a small office, facing airline officials and a stern-faced PR team. The gravity of her actions and their consequences were laid out before her. Not only was she banned from the airline, but her name and image were spreading across social media, attached to hashtags about privilege and racism. "Ms. Moore," one official said, his voice tinged with disappointment, "your actions today have far-reaching consequences. We hope you understand the severity of what transpired." Patricia, her earlier arrogance completely deflated, nodded mutely. The weight of her words and actions hung heavy on her shoulders. I never meant for this to happen," she mumbled, more to herself than to those around her. "Intention doesn't negate impact, Ms. Moore," the PR representative said firmly. "Your words and actions affected real people and perpetuated harmful stereotypes. Moving forward, we strongly suggest you take this as an opportunity for deep self-reflection and education." Meanwhile, as the Jacobs family concluded their press conference, they found themselves surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Airport staff, fellow travelers, and even a few local residents who had heard the news and rushed to the airport all wanted to express their admiration for how the family handled the situation. One elderly woman approached them, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice quavering. "Watching you stand up with such grace, it gave me hope. Hope that things can change." As they made their way through the airport, Marcus tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," he said, his young face serious, "I think I understand now why your work is so important. And Mom's too." Daryl smiled down at his son, feeling a surge of pride. "That's right, son. And someday, it might be your work too. We all have a part to play in making the world a little bit better." Vanessa, overhearing this, added, "And sometimes, Marcus, making a difference isn't about grand gestures. It's about how we conduct ourselves every day, how we treat others, and how we respond when we see injustice." As they finally exited the airport and climbed into their waiting taxi, the family felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. What had started as a simple family vacation had turned into something much more significant. Daryl turned to Vanessa as the taxi pulled away from the curb. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I have a feeling this trip is going to be about much more than just relaxation." Vanessa nodded, squeezing his hand. "I think you're right. But maybe that's exactly what we needed. A reminder of why we do what we do." Marcus, sandwiched between his parents, looked up at them both. "I'm proud of you, Mom and Dad," he said simply. As the taxi wound its way through the city streets towards their hotel, the Jacobs family knew that their journey, both literal and metaphorical, was far from over. The incident on the plane had been a stark reminder of the work still to be done in the fight against prejudice and discrimination. But it had also been a powerful lesson in dignity, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what's right. For Daryl, Vanessa, and young Marcus, it was a reaffirmation of their values and the impact that one family, standing strong in the face of adversity, could have on the world around them. As the city skyline came into view, symbolizing new horizons and possibilities, the Jacobs family looked toward the future with renewed purpose. They had come seeking a vacation, but found instead an opportunity to effect change, to spark important conversations, and to show the world what true class looks like. Their story, born from an ugly moment of prejudice, had blossomed into a beacon of hope and a call to action for all who witnessed it. And as they prepared to embrace whatever came next, the Jacobs family knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the most important journeys are the ones we never expected to take.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.